Assalamu alaikum. Actually, technically speaking, in Islamic law, when someone gives salams to a group, if only a single person in that group responds by saying wa alaikum assalam, then that's sufficient. So we don't have to, no one has to boom back the salams, although, of course, when we do that because of the fact that it reflects other things, our participation, in this group with each other. But technically speaking, assalamu alaikum wa alaikum assalam, that's all that's needed. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Allahumma iftah alayna bihikmatik وانشر علينا برحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على مولانا محمد وعلى آله في كل لمحة ونفس عدد ما وسعه علم الله. يا عليم علمنا من علمك ما ترضى به عنا ولا تؤاخذنا بما تعلمه منا. يا حليم خلقنا بخلق الحلم وحققنا بحقائق العلم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. My understanding of this session today is that the main topics that we want to talk about are the continuity of our community, the nature of our community, and then also the challenge that we face in order to really galvanize this Muslim community of the United States and its sister community of Canada into the most appropriate communities that they can be, for this time that we live in. As was mentioned in my bio, God blessed me to come into this faith 40 years ago, 4 decades ago, 1970. And at that time, when I came into Islam, it was through the indirect influence of Malcolm X, God have mercy upon him, whose autobiography at Cornell University, where I was studying at that time, had influenced me immensely. When I came into Islam at that time, the total population of Muslims in the United States of America was not 1/3 of the population of Muslims of Chicago today. Today in Chicago, we have at least 350,000 Muslims. Quite likely, we have more than that. Here in greater Los Angeles, your numbers are probably even twice or greater than the numbers of Chicago. In New York City, the numbers are probably even greater than Los Angeles. So today, we are faced with this amazing situation of a Muslim community that has transformed itself, or that has been transformed over the last 4 decades in a way that literally in 1970 was unimaginable. It was not to be imagined. So I'd like to begin with that we need to take account of who we are and what we are so that we can also discuss what we could be, the potential that we have to become. In the history of Islam, there are many significant minority communities. Certainly among the most important of those were the Muslims of China, who remain the greatest minority in China. And our foundation, the Nawawi Foundation, will be going to China again this summer, to get to know this Muslim community of China better. It is a community that has a great deal to teach us. But nevertheless, in the history of Islam, there has never been a community of Muslims, a minority community of Muslims, as strategically positioned as the Muslim community of the United States of America, and also its sister community in Canada. This is something very amazing, that here in a great superpower that influences immense power, that has exercised immense influence on the world, both politically and culturally and in other ways, and is one of the driving forces behind globalism, that in that community there is a Muslim minority that constitutes anywhere between 1% to 2% of the population. That remains to this time, and we hope that this will continue to be relatively free, so that we can educate ourselves, we can meet with each other, we can discuss what we want to do, we're free to speak. This is an amazing thing. And this community, as we see it today, is relatively new. This is essentially the process of the historical development of American Islam, which is old, and that's something that I want to talk about in a minute, which is, the most recent chapter of that history in the wake of 1965 and the assassination of Malcolm X and the voters' rights legislation of the civil rights movement. So after that time, the doors were opened in the United States for massive immigration from the third world, from the Muslim world, from Pakistan and India and Bangladesh, from the Arab world and so forth. And so during these last decades, we have seen the phenomenal growth of the Muslim population of the United States. And then, as is reflected in many of you today, we also see this new generation of young men and women who are remarkably talented, who have very high educational qualifications, and who also tend to do very well economically and financially. So this is a community which has tremendous potential. And in addition to the community of the immigrants and the sons and daughters of the immigrants who came over in the wake of 1965, we have also the indigenous, overwhelmingly African-American community, which makes up about 1/3 of the population. So it's very important, that these two communities are brought together in a dynamic way. It's very important that we develop a sense of ourselves and of our mission that really enables us to do something dynamic in this country, something that makes us not just a community that survives and preserves its identity, but that also makes us a community that's able to be a vanguard and that is able to show the United States and to show the Western world what Islam can be and what it should be in the 20th century. So the Muslims of the United States really face a great challenge, and that is to live up to this task. We are in a strategic position. No Muslim community has been in such a strategic position in history, but we have to live up to that We have to rise up to that challenge. We have to galvanize ourselves, and inshallah, we have to fulfill that responsibility. Two of the most important things in the success of a religious community are continuity and the sense of community. Continuity and the definition of the community, the vision that the community has of itself and of its identity. And I think that this first topic, the topic of continuity, is one that this session is especially designed for. So today, when we look at the Muslim community of the United States and of Canada, but especially of the United States, this is a remarkably new community in that this growth of the population is really the effect of the last 40 years. But remarkably, we also inherit an amazing past, which no other European country or Western country shares in the same way. So Islam here is nothing new. And it is very important for us to learn that history and to teach that history and to use that history to inform us of ourselves. It is almost certain, I think that we can prove it beyond a doubt, that Muslims were in the Americas in the pre-Columbian period. We know, for example, that in 1312, the king of Mali at that time, Abu Bakr II, Abu Bakr Khan Musa II, sent 2,400 boats across the Atlantic Ocean from the Gambia River, and he reached the other side. We have a terracotta evidence that shows Mandingo figures in ancient Mexico that reached that part of the world in the 14th century. And in the language of the Caribs and of the Arawaks, the Native Americans who lived in that part of the Caribbean, we find Arabic words that come to them through the Mandingo language and through the Wolof language, which also came over with the Mandingos. So this is an amazing historical event. And these are the kind of things that we have to study, we have to look into, and we have to bring to light. When Cortez came to Mexico in the 16th century and conquered the city of Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, he writes in his memoirs that he found in that city beautiful mosques, mezquitas bonitas, and he found in it also many pagan temples, teocalis, and he found in it beautiful houses. So this is an amazing statement, and this kind of a statement, which we find in Cortez, we find also in the accounts of the other conquistadores, of the other conquerors in the New World. Pizarro says the same sort of thing. So it is clear then that when the Spanish conquerors came to the New World, they perceived themselves as having discovered part of the classical Islamic world in which Islam existed, in which Islam coexisted side by side with Native American religion. And to me, this is a testimony of the consequences of the Mandingo crossing of King Abu Bakr II and probably of other crossings that were before that time. And probably, if we're able to study this and look at it in great detail, we will discover that at least in certain Native American tribes, there were two traditions. There was an indigenous Native American tradition. Thank you. There was an indigenous Native American tradition that had been here before, and then within that same tribe, there was an Islamic tradition that coexisted with it. Probably the parallel here is again what we see in West Africa. Because in West African Islam, the Islam of the Mandingos, that's sort of the way that Islam existed in their society, that it existed as a parallel tradition, a parallel cultural tradition alongside the African religion that they had inherited. And that, I believe, is also what happened in the case of a number of Native Americans. Can we prove this? Seek and you will find. I think that what's really important for us to do is to do very careful historical research, linguistic research, archaeological research, and begin with the things which are most clear. Again, in the case of the Mandingo crossing of the early 14th century, that, I think, is a very clear case. And that is something that we can prove. And then it begins to explain to us many other things. The fact that when the Spanish conquerors of the 16th century came here, that they believed they were finding Muslims side by side with indigenous Americans, that's a fact which historians do not contend. That's something that American historians have discovered in the writings of the Spanish since they began to look at those writings. Okay, so that's not a question. The problem is the problem of interpretation. And because of the fact that most Western historians cannot imagine that Islam could have been present in the New World and that there actually could have been an Islamic tradition here alongside the indigenous tradition, they simply look upon those statements as illusions, as the delusions of Spanish conquerors who had been fighting against the Muslims in Iberia for 800 years, and who then, when they come to America, they sort of have Muslims on their brain, and they imagine that they see these people wherever they go. I don't believe that that was the case at all. So this calls for a radical rewriting of our history, and it has to be based on sound knowledge, sound historical knowledge, following up the things that we know and proving it. I was in Gambia this last January, and I spoke about the transatlantic crossing of Mansa Kankan Abu Bakr II, and I showed some of the terracottas. Terracottas are, clay figures that come out of ancient Mexico to the audience that was largely Mandingo and Wolof. And later on, after the lecture, Mandingos came up to me and they said that not only are these figures from ancient Mexico Mandingos, but we can actually identify their tribes, we can actually identify the social positions they held in those tribes. For example, one of these terracottas is a terracotta of a man with a sort of a helmet that looks sort of like a turban, and he has a very black face. He has a certain type of garment that he's wearing, and it was brought to my attention that this man was a dolso. He was a Mandingo hunter, and he would have had spiritual powers, and he would have been one of the leaders of the expedition, who would have led them across the sea, and then also when they got to America, he's the one who would have helped them to find the trails and the paths that the armies would cross, that they would use to go through the jungles and so forth. So this is an amazing story, and these are the kind of things that we have to follow up on, which is a completely new vision of the New World and of its history. In the colonial period, when the Europeans come to the Americas and they begin to colonize it, especially when the Spanish begin that process in the course of the 16th century, then Muslims are brought over with them. They come over with them at exactly the same time. And they are a very important part of the history of the New World. These Muslims come primarily as slaves. They come as West African slaves, 15% or more of whom were Muslims. The others were animists. And then also there were other groups. There were the Moriscos, who were the Spanish and Portuguese Muslims who had been forced to convert to Christianity by the Inquisition. They also come over in great numbers. They are the builders. They are the workers. And one of the things that has come to light also is the fact that the Spanish brought over Muslims from the Philippines at the same time that the Spanish were conquering the New World. They were also conquering the Philippine Islands. And the Philippine Islands had, Islam had penetrated into all of those islands. It was oldest and it was strongest in the south, but it also existed in the north. And in Manila, which was called Amanullah, the security of Allah, that was the name that was given to the port, the ruler was a Muslim ruler. The Spanish were able to conquer the Muslims of the northern Philippines. They were not able to conquer the Muslims of the southern Philippines. And the Muslims that they conquered in the northern Philippines, many of those were brought to America also as slaves, and they were settled in Cuba and in Puerto Rico and in different parts of the Caribbean. I recently wrote a paper, which inshallah we hope to have on our website very soon, which is called Turks, Moors, and Moriscos in Early Colonial America. The story of Sir Francis Drake and the liberated galley slaves. This is another story which pertains much more to us in the historical United States. When the English established their first colony in the United States, which was in British America, which later would become the United States and Canada, they established the colony of Roanoke off the coast of North Carolina. And this colony of Roanoke, which many of you probably studied about as the Lost Colony, this colony of Roanoke was a privateering colony. It was not like the colony of Jamestown in Virginia or of Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts, which were colonies intended to implant populations and to create an agrarian way of life. Instead, the population of Roanoke was put there for privateering, which is a type of sort of like piracy. Their purpose was to attack the Spanish ships that were coming out of the Caribbean and that were laden with gold and silver. That was their purpose. And the ships that came to Roanoke, their names were not like the Mayflower. Their names were the Hawk and the Eagle and the Tiger. They were big and powerful ships. Sir Francis Drake, who was part of this process, Sir Francis Drake, who was part of the colonizing of the colony of Roanoke, before he came to Roanoke, this was in 1586, he swept along the Spanish coast, and then he came into the Caribbean, and he attacked a number of Spanish colonies. And in the process of doing this, he was privateering, he was getting gold and silver. He had like 40 ships with him, a very big navy. But one of the things that he discovered was that when the Spanish came out to fight him, they came out in galleys. Galleys, are these ships that had oars, and they had oarsmen. And the Spanish used galleys for their artillery. And they used galleys because of the fact that the galleys could be steered by the oars, and you didn't have to depend upon the wind or sails. So Drake attacked some of these galleys, and in the process, he liberated the galley slaves. And the galley slaves were overwhelmingly Muslim. He liberated over 400 galley slaves. And these galley slaves were Turks, they were ethnic Greeks who were also Muslims, and they were also Moors, that is, Muslims of North Africa, and they were also Moriscos, Spanish and Portuguese Muslims who had been converted to Christianity, but who had shown themselves not to be very good Christians, and therefore had been judged by the Inquisition, and as a punishment for their heresy had been condemned to work in the galleys until they died. So this is an amazing thing. Drake took 400 or more galley slaves, overwhelmingly Muslim, and he liberated them, he put them in his ships, and then he brought them to this new colony of Roanoke off the coast of North Carolina. It's an amazing story. And what happened to them, we don't really know. In the United States, we have the history of the Melungeon people and also of the Lumbee people who have their roots in Roanoke, and maybe also they have roots in these populations. That's something that we don't know for sure. It's something very possible, and it's something that needs to be studied, and if it's true, proven. But one of the things that Drake did, because of the fact that his attack upon the Spanish Empire was so effective, it brought about a response from Spain itself. And so Spain put together the Armada, which we've all heard of, the Great Spanish Armada of the 1590s. And it sent that Armada, to attack England. And 1588. And when the Spanish did that, and the Armada is setting out from Spain to go to England to attack it, then Drake and all of the other privateers who were in the colony of Roanoke, they had to pack up and they had to go home. That was the end of the colony. So it's no mystery of what happened. What happened was that they were called back as military duty to defend the homeland, to defend England from the Armada, which they themselves had provoked by their attacks on the Spanish in the Caribbean. When Drake went back, he took with him the Turks. That's something that we know. So again, the galley slaves that he freed were Turks and Moors and Moriscos. The Turks he took back, we know that for sure. And England at that time was cultivating a special relationship with the Ottoman Turks. And the Ottoman Turks, in turn, were developing a very special relationship with the Protestants of Europe. This is the time when the Protestant Reformation is really getting started and getting off the ground. So in order to make a stronger bond with the Turks, and in order to create alliances and also trade connections that were much more in English interests than the British Parliament voted to repatriate the Turks, these Turks that Sir Francis Drake had liberated in the Caribbean Sea as galley slaves. And so they were taken back. There was a lot of fanfare about that. The Muslims welcomed it wherever they saw it. Queen Elizabeth became extremely popular in the Muslim world, and the Turks and the Palestinians and others who knew about this, because they stopped for a while in Palestine on their way to Istanbul, they were amazed that Queen Elizabeth, a woman, would have the power to do something like this, and that also that she would have the compassion to take these Muslims and to send them home. So we know that the Turks, at least most of the Turks, they went back to the Ottoman Empire. What we don't know about are the Moors and the Moriscos. And I haven't found any mention of that. We know definitely that they were there. We know definitely that they were liberated. Were they left in America? Were they lost in America? There was also a great storm that came to Roanoke when Drake was there, that destroyed a lot of the ships and drowned a lot of the people. So it may be that many of them were also moored there. They were left there. In any case, these are part of our history that's really amazing. So the very first colony, the very first English colony, the colony of Roanoke in the New World, is one also that has this pattern of the coexistence of the Europeans with the Muslims. Later, as the United States develops, and I know that this is something that is not new to most of you, then we have the continuation of that history. And just to say a few words about it, one of the things that we have to be really clear about is that among the African American, the African slaves who were brought over who were Muslims, the origins of African American literature begin with Job ben Solomon, Ayuba ibn Suleiman Diallo. This is a beautiful man who was born in the early 1700s, who was enslaved and brought to America. You can get his picture on Wikipedia, on the internet. And then he was liberated, he was sent back to Africa. But Thomas Blewett, who took an interest in him, who had a personal interest in him and his family, wrote the memoirs of Job ben Solomon. And these memoirs, which have literary and historical value of their own, they are also the first instance of an African American literature. So that also begins with, an African American Muslim. I wrote a book in 2006, A Muslim in Victorian America, The Life of Alexander Russell Webb. Alexander Russell Webb, who became a Muslim in 1888, was at that time, to my knowledge, the first prominent American who embraced Islam, who was not of Muslim origin, but who embraced Islam. And his story is a really amazing story, and I invite you to read that book and to look at his story. It's really, it's not marginal, it's something very central to American history. But one of the things that was brought to my attention by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is the fact that there was another prominent American who was also a convert to Islam, who was before Webb. And quite possibly, if we begin to study this and look into it, we will find others. And this is George Bethune English. George Bethune English was born in 1786, I believe, and he died around 1828. He didn't live very long. But George Bethune English went to Harvard University. He studied theology at Harvard. He was one of the best students in the university. He took honors in his studies. And then in 1811, he received a master's of theology at Harvard with honors. After that, however, Bethune began to write about his doubts about Christianity. And he wrote tracts that were very, very important at that time about the Christian religion and his belief that the original teaching of Jesus had been lost or had been changed. And after the War of 1812, let me take some more water. I have to apologize for my voice. I'm still jet lagged from coming back from a long trip, and I don't seem to be able to quite get over that. But after the War of 1812, English went to Egypt. He served in the diplomatic corps of the United States from that time until his death in 1828. And in Egypt, he became a Muslim. He accepted Islam. He joined the forces of Ismail Pasha. He took a journey with Ismail Pasha into the Sudan, and he wrote a very important tract on his journeys in the Sudan. And one of the things that you see in English is that, like Webb, who comes after him, he adopted Islam with great fervor, with great enthusiasm, and with great love. And he was very conflicted about the Muslim world that he saw, because he saw that it often lived contrary to the spirit of the religion that he had adopted. So again, this is an amazing history that we have. And it's very important for us, to study that history, to write about it, and then also to cultivate it, so that we are aware of the fact that we have this great continuity, these roots upon which to build. In the 20th century, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, that history continues. When the immigrants come over in the 19th century, they also contribute very much to American life. One of the first immigrants that we know about came over in 1856. He came to roughly the area of Phoenix, Arizona. He was called by the Americans High Jolly, which was an Americanization of his name, Hajj Ali. He was part of the Camel Corps, of the United States, which had been created to expand into the territories of the Southwest. His grave is to the west of Phoenix. I've been there and seen it. He was highly decorated. And again, he's a very colorful part of the American past, and he's also part of the continuity of our tradition. I'd like to end with that and turn the podium over to my friend, Dr. Jackson. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.